I asked for a timeout. She rolled her eyes and locked the door asterisk. The ship screamed through the violet atmosphere like a dying star, metal groaning against forces it was never meant to endure. Captain Zara Knox gripped the controls with white knuckles, her dark hair whipping around her face as the vessel bucked and rolled through the alien sky. Warning lights painted her olive skin in angry reds as she fought to keep the exploration craft from becoming a crater. "Come on, girl," she whispered to her ship, the same way she might comfort a wounded animal. "Just a little longer." The ground rushed up to meet them, a landscape of crystalline forests and silver streams that would have been beautiful if she weren't about to crash into it. Zara pulled back hard on the stick, managing to level out just enough to turn certain death into merely probable injury. The ship clipped the tops of the strange trees, sending showers of what looked like liquid starlight cascading through the air, before finally skidding to a halt in a clearing that seemed almost too perfect to be natural. Smoke rose from the crumpled hull as Zara dragged herself from the pilot's seat, her left shoulder screaming in protest. Blood trickled down her forehead from where she'd struck the console, and her ribs felt like someone had used them for percussion practice. But she was alive, on a world that scans had suggested might actually be habitable. The air that flowed through the breach in her ship's hull was sweet and warm, a carrying sense of flowers she couldn't name and something that reminded her of rain on summer evenings back on Earth. She stumbled outside, legs shaky from adrenaline and impact, and got her first real look at the alien world. It was breathtaking. Towering spires of what appeared to be living crystals stretched toward twin suns that painted everything in shades of gold and amber. The trees themselves seemed to pulse with inner light, their leaves catching and reflecting illumination in ways that made them appear to dance even in the still air. In the distance, she could see structures that were clearly artificial, but so elegantly integrated with the natural landscape that they seemed to have grown rather than been built. "Well," Zara said to herself, wincing as she pressed a hand to her ribs, "at least it's pretty." She was so absorbed in taking inventory of her injuries and her surroundings that she almost missed the movement at the edge of the clearing. Almost. Years of military training kicked in, and she spun toward the motion. Despite the spike of pain it sent through her shoulder, what she saw made her forget about the pain entirely. He stood at the border between crystal forest and clearing, tall and lean with an otherworldly grace that made every movement seem like choreographed poetry. His skin held a faint luminescent quality, pale as moonlight but with an underlying shimmer that shifted between silver and blue depending on how the light caught him. Hair the color of starshine fell in waves to his shoulders, and when he turned his head to look directly at her, she saw eyes like captured aurora, swirling greens and blues and purples that seemed to hold depths she could lose herself in. For a long moment they simply stared at each other across the clearing. Zara's hand instinctively moved toward the emergency beacon on her belt, but something in his posture, curious rather than threatening, cautious but not hostile, made her pause. He took a step forward. She noticed that he moved with the fluid grace of a dancer or perhaps a predator, each footfall silent despite his height. When he spoke, his voice was like music played on instruments she'd never heard, melodic and layered with harmonics that seemed to resonate in her bones. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakably questioning, concerned even. "I don't suppose you speak standard?" Zara asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fact that she was having what might be first contact with an alien species. Because this would be a really good time for universal translators to be more than just science fiction. He tilted, his head at her words, those incredible eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel suddenly self-conscious. Then he did something that surprised her. He smiled. It was a small thing, barely a curve of lips that were perhaps a shade too pale to be human. But it transformed his entire face from merely beautiful to something that made her heart skip, in a way that had nothing to do with her injuries. Slowly, carefully, he approached. Each step was deliberate, telegraphed. The way someone might approach a wounded animal, they were trying not to frighten. When he was close enough that she could see the intricate patterns that seemed to be tattooed or perhaps naturally occurring along his neck and arms, he stopped and raised one long-fingered hand to his chest. "Kellen," he said, the word clear and distinct. Zara blinked, then felt a smile tug at her own lips. "Despite everything, Zara," she replied, mimicking his gesture. His smile widened at that, and he said her name back to her, rolling the syllables around in his mouth like he was tasting them. The way he pronounced it, with that musical voice and slight accent she couldn't place, made her own name sound like something beautiful and foreign. Then his gaze fell to the blood on her forehead and the way she was favoring her left side. His expression shifted to something she recognized despite their obvious differences. Concern, the universal language of compassion. He spoke again. Longer phrases this time, gesturing toward her injuries and then toward the direction he'd come from. She caught what might have been questions in his tone, offers perhaps. When she didn't respond beyond a helpless shrug, he seemed to make a decision. Moving with that same deliberate care, he approached close enough to touch. She tensed, every instinct screaming warnings about unknown alien physiology and potential contamination. But when he raised his hand toward her forehead, she found herself holding still. His fingertips barely brushed the cut above her eyebrow. But the touch sent an electric tingle through her entire body. Not painful, but definitely not normal either. She watched his eyes widen slightly, as if he'd felt something unexpected too. For just a moment, she could have sworn she felt something else in her mind. Not thoughts exactly, but impressions. Concern, curiosity, and underneath it all, a warmth that felt remarkably like kindness. Kellen stepped back, studying her with those aurora eyes, and she wondered if he'd felt the same strange connection. When he gestured again toward the crystal spires in the distance and spoke in that musical language, she found herself nodding, even though she didn't understand the words. Sometimes, she thought as she prepared to follow this beautiful stranger into an alien world, the heart knew things the mind hadn't figured out yet. Following Kellen through the crystal forest was like walking through a living dream. The trees responded to his presence, their inner light pulsing brighter as he passed, leaves chiming softly in harmonies that seemed to welcome him home. Zara stumbled occasionally, her injuries making the uneven ground treacherous, but each time she faltered, Kellen was there to steady her with gentle hands and that same warm smile. They walked for what felt like hours, though the twin suns never seemed to move in the alien sky. The path they followed wasn't visible to Zara's eyes, but Kellen navigated it with the confidence of someone who had traveled this way countless times. Occasionally he would pause, place his palm against one of the crystal trees, and listen to something she couldn't hear. Each time the tree would pulse with brighter light, and she began to suspect he was somehow communicating with the forest itself. When they finally emerged from the woods, Zara gasped. Before them stretched a city that looked like it had been grown rather than built. Graceful spires twisted upward like frozen waterfalls, their surfaces reflecting and refracting light in ways that created dancing rainbows in the air. Gardens cascaded down the sides of buildings, and she could see figures moving through the spaces between structures with the same fluid grace that Kellen possessed. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and Kellen turned to look at her. Something that might have been pride flickering across his features. He led her not toward the main city, but to a smaller structure nested in the hillside like a jewel set in living rock. Vines covered with flowers that glowed like captured stars wound around its entrance. And the air here felt different, charged with an energy that made her skin tingle inside. The space opened up into chambers that took her breath away. The walls themselves were alive with soft light, pulsing gently like a massive heartbeat. Pools of what looked like liquid silver reflected the ceiling, which was covered in patterns that seemed to shift and change as she watched. The entire space felt organic, alive, as if they had stepped inside some massive organism rather than a building. Kale-Ann guided her to what was clearly a healing chamber, gesturing for her to sit on what appeared to be a bed made of woven light. When she hesitated, he spoke softly, his voice carrying that same gentle insistence she remembered from their first meeting. Despite not understanding his words, she found herself trusting him. The moment she settled onto the strange surface, warmth spread through her body. Not heat exactly, but a gentle energy that seemed to seek out her injuries and cradle them. Pain in her shoulder began to ease and the throbbing in her ribs settled to a dull ache. Kellen moved around the chamber with practiced efficiency, gathering what she assumed were medical supplies from alcoves in the walls. Everything he collected seemed to be alive. Plants that glowed when touched, crystals that hummed with contained energy, vials of liquid that shifted colors like aurora borealis. When he returned to her side, he paused, clearly asking permission. With his eyes before he began to tend to her wounds, Zara nodded. His touch was infinitely gentle as he cleaned the cut on her forehead with something that felt like liquid moonlight and numbed the pain instantly as he worked. She found herself studying his face. Up close, she could see that the patterns she'd noticed on his neck and arms extended across his skin in intricate designs that seemed to tell a story she couldn't read. His eyelashes were silver, like fine metal threads, and when he concentrated, tiny lines appeared between his brows that made him look unexpectedly human. "What are you?" she asked softly, not expecting an answer, but needing to voice the question. He looked up from his work, those incredible eyes meeting hers, and for a moment she felt that strange connection again. This time it was stronger, more defined. Caught impressions of vast spaces between stars, of a people who had chosen isolation over conflict, of songs that could heal and touch, that could speak deeper than words. Kellen's hand stilled on her shoulder. She realized he was experiencing the same phenomenon. His eyes widened, and he spoke a single word in his own language, soft with wonder. "What's happening to us?" Zara whispered. In response, he placed his palm flat against her uninjured shoulder, skin to skin. The connection blazed brighter, and suddenly she could feel what he was feeling. Curiosity mixed with something that felt dangerously like attraction. Concern for her well-being, and underneath it all, a loneliness that echoed her own. Through the link, she sensed his surprise at the depth of the connection between them. His people were naturally empathic. She understood now, but this was something more, something unprecedented. When he finally pulled his hand away, they both felt the loss of contact like a physical ache. Kellen sat back on his heels, studying her with an expression that held new depth. "Your people," she said, gesturing vaguely toward where she assumed the city lay. "They don't know I'm here, do they?" Saw the answer in his face before he spoke. When he did respond, she didn't need translation to understand that what he was doing, bringing her here, healing her, hiding her presence, went against everything his society expected of him. "Why?" she asked. "Why risk it?" Kellen was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and touched her face, fingers tracing the line of her cheek with reverent gentleness. When their eyes met, she saw her own reflection in those aurora depths. But more than that, she saw the beginning of something that transcended species and culture and every rational thought she'd ever had about first contact protocols. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. But she understood the emotion behind the words, even if their meaning was lost to her. In any language, in any world, the sound of someone falling in love was unmistakable. As night fell over the alien world, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Zara realized that her crash landing had been the best accident of her life. Whatever happened next, whatever the consequences of this impossible connection, she was exactly where she was meant to be, in the healing chamber. Surrounded by living light, and cradled in the presence of someone who saw her as more than just another species, she finally felt like she'd found home. 3 days passed in the healing sanctuary, and with each hour the bond between Zara and Kellen grew stronger. Her injuries mended with miraculous speed under his care, but more than that, they were learning to communicate in ways that transcended language. Touch became their universal translator, each contact sparking that electric connection that allowed them to share emotions, memories, and something deeper than words. On the 4th morning, Kellen arrived carrying what appeared to be clothing, woven from starlight itself. The fabric shimmered and flowed like liquid silver, and when Zara touched it, it felt like wearing moonbeams. "For me?" she asked, and his smile was answer enough. The garment fit her perfectly, adjusting to her form, as if it were alive. When she emerged from behind the privacy screen he'd created with woven light, Kellen's expression made her feel more beautiful than any mirror ever had. He spoke then, gesturing toward the entrance, and she understood he was asking if she wanted to see more of his world. The rational part of her mind whispered warnings about exposure, about the risks he was taking. But her heart had already made the decision. They left the sanctuary under cover of the strange twilight that seemed to fall. Between the rotation of the twin suns, Kellen led her through paths she was certain were not used by others of his kind. Hidden ways that wound through gardens where the flowers sang in harmonies that made her soul ache with their beauty. The first garden they visited was dedicated to memory flowers, blossoms that could store and replay experiences when touched. Kellen showed her how to activate them with gentle pressure, and she gasped as her mind filled with visions of his childhood. Images of ceremonies where his people danced with light itself, moments of joy and sorrow that felt as real as her own. Memories. Credible, she breathed, and when she looked at him, she saw tears, like liquid diamonds tracking down his cheeks. Through their connection, she understood that he had never shared these sacred memories with anyone. Among his people, such intimacy was reserved for life-bonding ceremonies, and the fact that he was sharing them with her, an outsider, an alien, was a transgression that could cost him everything. "Kellen," she said softly, reaching for his hand. The moment their fingers intertwined, she felt his loneliness, vast and deep as the space between stars. His people valued connection, but they also valued conformity. He was different from them, too curious about the worlds beyond their crystal forests, too willing to question the isolation that had protected them for millennia. In the next garden, surrounded by flowers that glowed like captured moonlight, he showed her the memory of the day he'd first seen her ship falling from the sky. She felt his wonder, his immediate need to help despite knowing the danger it represented. "You could have let me die," she whispered. His response came not in words but in the depth of emotion that flowed between them. He touched her face, thumb brushing across her lips, and she felt his certainty that letting her die would have been letting a part of himself die as well. The moment stretched between them, electric and inevitable. When he leaned closer, she rose to meet him, and their first kiss was like touching lightning. The connection between them blazed so bright that the flowers around them began to glow brighter in response, as if the garden itself was celebrating their union. When they finally broke apart, both were trembling. Kellen rested his forehead against hers, and through their bond, she felt his amazement at the intensity of what they'd just shared. Among his people, such connections took decades to develop. What they had found in mere days was unprecedented. "Is dangerous," she said, though she made no move to pull away from him. His answer was to kiss her again, deeper this time, his hands tangling in her hair, as if he were afraid she might disappear. When they separated, he spoke against her lips, words she didn't need translation to understand. "Forever, always, mine." They spent hours in that garden, sharing kisses and touches that sent waves of pleasure and connection rippling between them. Kellen showed her how his people communicated through touch, how skin against skin could convey complex emotions and even abstract concepts. She learned that the patterns on his skin were actually a form of language, that when she traced them with her fingers, she was literally writing poetry on his body. As the night deepened, he led her to a pool of water that reflected not the sky above, but some other realm entirely. Stars that weren't in any constellation she knew danced across its surface. And when Kellen encouraged her to touch the water, her reflection showed her as she might look in his world, luminescent and strange and beautiful. "Is this how you see me?" she asked. His response was to pull her into his arms and show her exactly how he saw her, not as alien or other, but as the missing piece of his soul finally returned to him. They made love beside that impossible pool, her human warmth mixing with his otherworldly grace in ways that rewrote every assumption either of them had ever held about love and connection. Their bodies fit together as if they had been designed for each other, and when their connection reached its peak, the very air around them sparkled with released energy. Afterward, as they lay entwined beneath stars from two different skies, Zara felt a contentment she had never experienced before. Kellen's fingers traced idle patterns on her skin while she played with his starlight hair, both of them reluctant to break the spell that surrounded them. But even in paradise, reality has a way of intruding. The sound that broke their peaceful aftermath was unlike anything Zara had ever heard, a harmonic resonance that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Kellen tensed against her, and through their connection, she felt his sudden spike of fear. "What is it?" she asked, though she already knew from his reaction that whatever was happening was very bad. He was already pulling on his clothes, speaking rapidly in his own language. But she didn't need translation to understand the urgency in his voice. The sound came again, closer this time, and she saw lights moving through the forest beyond the garden searchers, and they were heading straight for the sanctuary where her ship's wreckage lay hidden. Kellen took her hand, his touch conveying a desperate message. They had been discovered, and everything they had found together was about to be torn apart. The council chamber was unlike anything Zara had ever imagined. It's vast and circular, its walls seemed to be made of living crystal that pulsed with inner light, responding to the emotions of those within. 12 figures sat in judgment, their forms more ethereal than Kellen's, as if they were constructed of light and memory rather than flesh and bone. Their voices, when they spoke, created harmonies that resonated through the floor and into her bones. Zara knelt in the center of the chamber, hands bound with what appeared to be solidified moonlight, beautiful to look at, but absolutely unbreakable. Kellen stood to her right, his own bonds glowing with a harsher light that seemed to burn against his luminescent skin. Through their connection, she could feel his pain, both physical and emotional. The eldest of the council, a being whose form seemed to shift between male and female with each breath, spoke in the musical language of Kellen's people. Zara didn't need translation to understand the judgment in that voice. The condemnation that seemed to make the very air heavy with disapproval. Kellen responded, his voice steady despite the circumstances. She felt his determination through their bond, his absolute refusal to apologize for what they had found together. When he gestured toward her, she caught her own name in the flow of his words, and she understood he was defending not just their relationship, but her right to exist in his world. The response from the council was swift and harsh. Several members spoke at once, their voices creating a dissonant chord that made the crystal walls pulse with angry red light. Through Kellen's growing distress, Zara began to understand the magnitude of what they faced. Contact with outsiders was forbidden. Always had been, ever since Kellen's people had chosen isolation over the wars that raged among the stars. They had built their paradise by turning away from the universe beyond their crystal forests. And Kellen's actions threatened the very foundation of their society. But more than that, what he felt for her was impossible according to their understanding of the world. The deep bonding they had experienced should have taken decades to develop, and only between members of their own species. The fact that it had happened instantly with an alien suggested either that their entire understanding of connection was flawed, or that what they felt was some kind of dangerous aberration. The eldest council member rose, her form solidifying into something more definitively female, and spoke directly to Kellen. Zara felt his shock ripple through their bond, followed immediately by a grief so profound it nearly brought her to her knees. "What did they say?" She whispered. Gat's voice when he answered was barely audible. "They offer me a choice. Renounce our bond and return to the community, or be exiled with you into the void between worlds." Zara's heart clenched. She had seen enough of his memories to understand what exile meant for his people. They were connected to their world in ways that went beyond the merely physical. Cut off from the crystal forests and the network of light that connected all living things on this planet, he would slowly fade, becoming a shadow of himself until there was nothing left but longing and regret. "You have to choose them," she said, though the words felt like swallowing broken glass. "I won't let you destroy yourself for me." His response was immediate and fierce. Through their bond, she felt his absolute refusal to even consider abandoning her. But she also felt something else, a plan forming in the depths of his mind, desperate and dangerous. The council gave them until the next sunrise to decide. They were separated then, Zara taken to a holding chamber deep in the city's heart. While Kellen was returned to his family compound under heavy guard, the moment the physical distance broke their connection, she felt the loss like a physical wound. The holding chamber was beautiful in the way. Everything in this world seemed to be walls of living crystal, soft light that adjusted to her emotional state, even a bed that molded itself to her form for maximum comfort. But beauty couldn't mask the fact that it was still a prison. She spent hours pacing the small space, mind racing as she tried to think of some way out of this situation that wouldn't require Kellen to sacrifice everything for her. Every solution she considered came back to the same conclusion. There was no way to make this work that didn't end in tragedy for one or both of them. Night fell. With it came a sound she almost didn't recognize her own name, whispered, so quietly it might have been imagination. But when she pressed her ear to the crystal wall, she heard it again, and her heart leaped. Kellen? His response was barely audible, filtered through layers of living stone, but unmistakably him. She pressed her palm against the wall and felt the faintest echo of their connection, enough to understand that he was in an adjacent chamber. What followed was the strangest conversation of her life. It's conducted through crystal walls and touch. Using the empathic connection they shared to communicate in ways that bypassed the need for words, he told her about his plan, dangerous and probably impossible. But the only chance they had of staying together, there were places between worlds. Spaces where the barriers between realities grew thin. As people knew of them, but avoided them, considering them dangerous aberrations. But if they could reach one of those spaces, they might be able to find sanctuary in a realm where the laws of his world held no power. The journey would be treacherous, and there was no guarantee they would survive. But the alternative was losing each other forever, and that was unacceptable to both of them. As dawn approached, bringing with it the deadline for their decision, Kellen put his plan into motion. The first sign was the tremor that ran through the building, followed by the sound of alarms unlike anything in her experience, harmonic warnings that spoke of emergency and chaos. Through the wall, she felt Kellen's touch against her mind, and suddenly she understood. He wasn't just planning to escape, he was planning to take her ship's power core with them. The one piece of her technology that might allow them to tear a hole between realities, the chamber door dissolved, and he was there, his bonds somehow broken, his eyes blazing with determination and desperate love. In his hands was a weapon that looked like crystallized lightning, and the way he held it told her he was prepared to use it against anyone who tried to stop them. "Are you ready to run away with me to the end of the universe?" he asked, and despite everything, she found herself smiling. "Try and stop me," she replied. Together they ran toward an uncertain future, love driving them forward into the unknown. The escape from the Crystal City was like fleeing through a living nightmare made of light and song. Alarms wailed in harmonies that hurt Zara's ears, while the buildings themselves seemed to shift and move, trying to trap them within their glowing embrace. Kellen led her through passages that hadn't existed moments before, his connection to the city's living architecture allowing him to reshape their path, even as the pursuing guards closed in behind them. "There," he gasped, pointing toward a structure that looked like a massive flower made of metal and starlight. "Your ship's core is in the research center." They sprinted across a bridge that sang warning songs under their feet, Kellen's weapon, cutting through defensive barriers like they were made of smoke. Behind them, Zara could hear the voices of the pursuers, calling out in the musical language that now sounded more like battle cries than poetry. The research center was a maze of corridors lined with devices that hummed with contained energy. In the central chamber, suspended in a web of light, was her ship's power core, a sphere of concentrated stellar fire that pulsed with the rhythm of a giant heart. "How do we get it out of there?" Zara asked, studying the containment field that surrounded the core. Kale's answer was to press his palm against a control surface that immediately began to glow in response to his touch. "The same way my people do everything, by asking nicely." For a moment she thought he was joking. Then she felt the wave of emotion that flowed from him toward the containment system, a complex message of need and love and desperate hope. To her amazement, the field began to weaken, the living technology responding to his emotional plea. "Incredible," she breathed. Your people really do speak to machines. Everything here is alive, he replied, his concentration focused on the delicate process of freeing the core. We don't build tools, we grow partners. Out. The power core settled into his arms like a sleeping child, its surface warm but not burning. The moment he lifted it free of its containment, alarms throughout the facility began screaming with renewed urgency. They ran again, through corridors that tried to close around them and past chambers where other research was being conducted. Glimpses of technologies that could reshape matter with thought, weapons that could sing stars into supernovas, archives that contained the memories of entire civilizations. Outside, the crystal forest waited, but it was no longer the peaceful sanctuary Zara remembered. The trees themselves had become part of the hunt, their branches reaching down to snare them while their roots erupted from the ground to block their path. The entire world was turning against them, and she realized with growing horror that Kellen's people commanded more than just their city. They were connected to the living essence of the planet itself. This way, Kellen shouted over the chaos, leading her toward what looked like a dead zone in the forest, a place where the crystal trees gave way to ordinary stone and metal. As they ran, she felt him weakening. The effort of carrying the power core while maintaining the energy output needed to reshape their path was draining him rapidly. His luminescent skin was growing dim, and she could see pain etched in every line of his beautiful face. Put me down, she said, though he wasn't carrying her. You're killing yourself trying to protect me. His response was to pull her closer, sharing some of his remaining energy through their connection. The gesture was so selfless it brought tears to her eyes. They reached the dead zone just as their pursuers caught up with them. The council members themselves had joined the hunt, forms blazing with power as they surrounded the small clearing where Zara and Kellen stood with their stolen prize. The eldest council member stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority as she spoke in the musical language. Kellen's response was defiant, but Zara could feel his exhaustion through their bond. He was running on love and determination alone. What is she saying? Zara asked. She's offering us one last chance to surrender, Kellen replied. Give back the core, accept memory wipe to forget each other, and you'll be sent safely back to your own people. Zara looked at the power core in his arms, then at the woman who represented everything his people valued: order, tradition, isolation from the chaos of the larger universe. Then she looked at Kellen, beautiful and alien and willing to sacrifice everything for what they had found together. The choice was easy, tell her, Zara said, taking the power core from his weakened hands. That some things are worth fighting for. She activated the core with a touch she'd learned from watching Kellen commune with living technology. But instead of approaching it with the gentle emotions his people used, she poured her own human feelings into it: fierce protective love, desperate determination, and a stubbornness that had carried her species to the stars despite every obstacle the universe had thrown at them. The core responded like it had been struck by lightning. Energy erupted from its surface in waves that made the air itself tear and split. Where the power touched the boundaries of reality, cracks appeared, glimpses of other worlds, other possibilities, other ways of being. Now, Kellen said, understanding immediately what she had done, before it destabilizes completely. Hand in hand, they leaped toward the largest of the reality tiers, leaving behind the only world Kellen had ever known for the uncertain promise of somewhere they could be together without judgment or condemnation. The passage between worlds felt like being turned inside out and rebuilt from component atoms. Zara felt Kellen's hand in hers, the only constant in a universe gone mad with possibility. Then they were falling through space that wasn't space, time that moved in spirals, and realities that existed only in the spaces between heartbeats. When they finally landed, it was on a beach of silver sand beneath a sky full of stars from a dozen different worlds. The air smelled of salt and flowers and something indefinably alien but not unwelcoming. In the distance, Zara could see the lights of a city that looked like it had been built by refugees from 100 different realities. Where are we? Shh, asked, helping Kellen to his feet. He was still weak, but his skin was beginning to glow again with soft inner light. Somewhere between everywhere, he replied, pulling her into his arms. A place for people who don't fit anywhere else. They kissed then, long and deep, while the power core settled into the sand beside them and began to grow roots of pure energy around them. The beach hummed with the voices of other exiles who had found their way to this impossible sanctuary. It wasn't the world either of them had been born to, but it was theirs. And sometimes, Zara thought, as she lost herself in Kellen's Aurora eyes, the best homes were the ones you built with someone who understood that love was worth any sacrifice in the distance. She could hear music, not the formal harmonies of Kellen's people, but something wilder and more joyful. The sound of hearts that had broken all boundaries and found something beautiful on the other side. They were home.